How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Good. It's been a crazy day. Hi, everyone in the Facebook world. We're here. We're a couple of minutes late. Apologies for that. So nuts, and we didn't even get a chance to chat before just sitting right online. So how's it been going? How are you doing?
Doing well. We're definitely, both of us are having busy weeks, busy lawyer mom weeks. So, but I'm ready to have our conversation. I always look forward to speaking with you on this topic.
Yeah. So, well, I guess we should do some introductions just in case, folks, this is their first time here. I am the founder of Atlas Book Club, a book subscription box company focused on globally diverse children's books. And you can learn more about us at www.atlasbookclub.com. And Mindy?
Hi, everyone. My name's Mindy Kids, and I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant here in Austin, Texas. And my passion project is making sure that we're raising our kids in a culturally competent way and an anti-racist way.
And so thank you everyone for joining us today. We're really looking forward to this discussion. So this is part two of an overarching discussion that Mindy and I have been having about the role of children's literature in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. And so we talked about that. You can check the Atlas Book Club Facebook page for our first conversation that we had last month. The goal is to have these conversations once a month and to explore a different part of what we believe that role is, what we believe the role of children's literature in the future workforce is. Today, we want to focus on building a diverse children's library. And last time you and I talked, we talked about the power of books. We talked about how the books that you select for your children and the books you read them at bedtime, how important that is and how that speaks a lot to, what your system of beliefs are, what your values are. So we're going to dig into that a little bit. Do you want to say anything before we dig in?
No, let's get to it.
Let's get to it. Okay. So you and I talked, and we have a list of about 10 tips we want to talk about, but we just want to pick a couple because 30 minutes is not enough time. So we just want to pick a couple and dive into those. So the one that I want to talk about is the idea of a single story. And I think that serves as the overarching thing that you constantly want to be thinking about when you're selecting diverse children's books for your kids. And if you haven't seen it yet, I've talked about this before, the TED Talk by Chimamanda Adichie, where she talks about the danger of a single story. And basically shattering that stereotype, shattering the idea that cultures have a single story, like this culture, that's their only story. And so when you're thinking about selecting a book for your child's library, you want to think, is this book shattering the single story? Is it shattering the single story? Is it perpetuating a dangerous stereotype? Is it, or does it explore different aspects of this particular culture or this country's story? So that's the one I wanted to dig into a little bit. And you and I talked about it many, many times. And I think you had some great points and also to share.
Yeah, and I think what's really important about the single story is that I think initially, if people are trying to build their library, they look for the one book to explain, India or Africa, and that's impossible. It's just like you couldn't buy one book to explain the United States experience. And what's interesting is a book that you just sent me recently. It's The Wheels on the Bus. And I'm going to use this as an example because, when we got it, my kids are 6 and 8, and they've heard the Wheels on the Bus song 1,000 times. I've sang it 1,000 times, but this book is set in Guatemala. Yeah. And what was interesting was that, to me, that's a single story. Like, everybody knows the Wheels on the Bus song. But when we got it, we open it up and the words are different. The pictures are beautiful, but then also the person who saves the bus is like an old grandma changing a tire. And I think that the whole thing was so interesting to me about like, it took a different turn on this traditional story that we always tell. And so that's one way that I look at the single story. The other thing is that when I am looking for books for my kids, I really want, and we've talked about this before, the diversity within a culture. And so people from one country or one region are not all the same. And I think that's the deeper lens that we have to get to. And so this is an intentional effort. And then with that, you have to explain the single story. You have to explain that, you know, if we want to talk about, you know, Mexico, for example, there's a lot to talk about with Mexico. There's lots of history. There's lots of regions, there's lots of religions, there's lots of issues, there's lots of different kinds of kids there. You know, there's the Pacific Ocean, if you want to talk about that. And it's really interesting because what I find is that when people reach out to me all the time asking for book recommendations for kids, and a lot of times they say, well, I have this one book about this one region and I love it. And I'm like, yeah, that's great. But like, let's add to that. Like, what's the other story from that region, because there's millions of stories.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, so let's talk about it in the context of what's happening in our country right now, right? And so there is a lot of interest in building an anti-racism library and a lot of interest in, oh, I want to get books, you know, that anti-racism, that talk about, you know, Black history, that talk about the civil rights movement. So there's all that going on. And those stories are extremely important, right? Of course, we should know history. Of course, absolutely. But we have to find a way to maintain a balance. Those stories are not our only stories. As African Americans, that's not the only story. You know, so there are so many stories out there. So the important thing is to find that balance between historical, you know, books and books that teach us the history, the civil rights movement, and balance that with stories that show the kids, or stories that show Black kids, you know, in a fantasy novel, in a graphics novel, and you know, like futuristic novels. And actually, and speaking of that, actually, earlier on, a post by Alina Roberts, our law mama friend. I saw her. Hi, Alina, if you're watching. I saw a post where she posted about there are so many few young adult books that feature Black boys. It's so frustrating. I have a 12-year-old Black boy, and I'm always searching, you know, books for him. And so a plug for Kwame Alexander books. He loves those books. So if you don't know who Kwame, and you definitely should check him out. I mean, he's wrote, I don't have any right here because I wasn't thinking to talk about that, but he wrote the Swing series, he wrote the Rebound, Solo, and my son just gobbles those up. So it just goes to show that representation is important, number one, but two, it's important for kids who are boys to see boys in these roles. And they're so few and far in between. It's so frustrating.
Yeah, and I think, you know, another thing that kind of goes along these lines is that you don't need to buy books that are just about, like, if you're looking for a Black boy in a character or in a book, he needs to be like your average Black boy. It doesn't need to be about his struggle against racism, because that's not what we always want to tie everything to. And I find that happens a lot, is that you don't have an average book with a lot of diversity of characters in it, unless the focus of that book is to teach a lesson. And it's interesting because I have some books on like gender diversity, whether it be trans or LGBT, you know, LGBTQ. And it's interesting because it's like all the books are about that. And I'm like, I would just like to see like a gay couple in a book that's not really about being gay. For my kids. Like, I don't, and I want to just seek out, and there is one book called Jack and Jim that I think I showed last time, that's about two birds, and it could be interpreted that they're like two men birds living together. But what's interesting is that, you know, for the sake of our kids, for representation, is it doesn't always need to be about the worst part of their history either. And for girls too, it doesn't always have to be like girl empowerment all the time. I'm like, and I have all those books, and I am raising a young girl, but it's also like, the idea that I want to give to her is that, yes, you need to be empowered, but like, not, you don't always have to situate yourself in being oppressed, because that is part of the problem. Is like, if we normalize that girls can be whatever they want to be, then you don't have to always have this, you don't always have to have this battle cry that this is a book about reaffirming girl positivity. Because if they were the leads in a lot of these books, or if Black boys were found in a lot of these 12 to 14-year-old books, it would just, it normalizes their life experience. And so that's the other thing I want to you know, focus on, is when we're looking at these books, is that it's important to teach about history. It's important to teach about, you know, different cultures, but it's also important to see that reflected in just ordinary life, or ordinary stories that are fun and simple for kids to read, and see other people other than themselves reflected in them.
Yeah. And I think those are the types of books, in my opinion, I don't know if there's any research to support this, but in my experience, and in my opinion, those are the types of books that kids connect with the most. Books that feature kids of color, or, you know, just kids in general being regular kids. Those are the books that resonate with them. I mean, why do you think kids love the Dogman series, for example? They love those, you know, those books, because it's just, you know, it features kids in class just being up to mischief and playing, and, you know, just being regular kids. So those are the books that resonate. And also, it's the idea that, you know, a white kid, for example, is reading this book that shows, you know, a kid from India, for example, or a Black boy, you know, from, I don't know, Brooklyn, and is reading that book, and is just being a regular kid. And the kid from India just happens to go home at night and make dal with his parents for, you know, for dinner. So it's that idea, like, oh, this kid is just like me. Oh man, it's so cool that he goes home and makes, you know, dal for dinner. So that's the idea, is just to, hey, we're actually more similar than we are different. You know, you can connect with another child in a different part of the country, in a different part of the world. They love the same things you do. They get into mischief with their friends. They get into trouble with their friends, you know, and it's so important that kids see books like that and see kids of color portrayed in that way.
Yeah, and I think it's like, to go off of that too, it's important that it's in the fun type of reading too, because sometimes when I'm having conversations with my kids, you know, it's like, I want it to just be how we're talking, or what we're reading, or the magazines that we're looking at have all the representation, and my lesson to them is about something different, or the fun, you know, like my kids love the Captain Underpants series.
Oh, yeah.
And you know, they love it. And it's like all their humor and all the jokes they like. And there's a Black boy and a white kid, but it's not about like it's not about like racism. It's just about like two kids invent this character, and it's hilarious, and like kids love it, and it's accessible. And the one, you know, one of the books that I wanted to share today, or the series of books that I bought for my kids when my son was just like 2 years old, because what I liked about him is that it's not, they teach lessons, but it's not about like racism, sexism, oppression. But what they do is they feature kids. So this, I'm going to show this up. So there's a series of books. This one's called Talk and Work It Out, but it's just kids doing kid things, getting in arguments at school, not wanting to share. How did they talk it out? And there's a series of books, and I have all of them. I think there's like maybe like 10 or 12 of these, but Be Careful and Stay Safe. And these kind of have like very accessible lessons for the kids. But what I like about it is it shows diversity in families. It shows, you know, there's like a little girl in these books who is in a hijab. There's kids in wheelchairs, but it's not about that. It's not about the girl in the hijab. It's just that she's there as part of the class, and she's struggling through being able to listen, or maybe, you know, the Black kid's having a hard time when he felt his ice cream fell off his ice cream cone, and like, how do we approach him and help him? And so what I like about these books, and I encourage, I mean, there's a whole series of them. I'll hold it up and I can give you the author's name. But what I encourage about these books, what I liked about them from an early age with my kids, was that it was just the people that they're around all the time. They're around a lot of diversity in their lives, is that the books were showing that as well. So it wasn't like just all white kids and we're trying to teach about like cleaning up your room. When I'm trying to teach them about why we have to clean our rooms and I show them a book, it's got a diversity of kids. And so that's the real lesson that I want to give today too, is that when you're creating a diverse children's library, it's not picking out one book, just like you don't want to have one gay friend or one Black friend. Like, you need to have relationships. It's the same with books. Like, your books need to be filled with relationships that are multicultural and multi-ethnic, but relationships are like, whether it's a funny graphic novel or whether they're taught, or whether they're adventurers, searching for treasure. Those books should include kids that are of all different races and ethnic backgrounds. And that's where you really get deep. And then your kids can see that them reflected in these stories that are fun and stories that are interesting, instead of it always being a lesson about their skin color or their gender. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but
yeah, no, you hit the nail on the head. You really did. So I want to, there's a book called, we featured it in a past box, but if you like the Dog Man, for anyone out there, if their kids like the Dog Man, Captain Underpants series, there's a series called Akisi, Tales of Mischief, I think. You can Google it, and they're coming out with a third one, but it's basically the same concept. It's this little Black girl set in Ivory Coast, and graphic novel, but the whole concept of her just hanging out with her friends, getting into trouble. It's called Tales of Mischief. It's such a fun book. So that's to say that they're out there, right? These books are out there. You have to know where to find them, because they're not, unfortunately, not easily accessible, but they are out there. And so I wanted to add to just talking about kids being regular kids. I have a few of my favorite here. Let's see, which one am I going to pick? Okay, I'll pick this one. So this is Get Off That Camel. And so this is, have you read that? Yeah. I love this book. So this is a little Indian boy who just, is it boy or girl? I can't remember now. It's up to some mischief and just being a regular kid. And and it's set in India. I absolutely love this book. And another one is, so this is by Press. It's the Lolo series. Again, this is early chapter books that's ideal for first grade, second grade. So in that 7 to 9-year-old age group. But yeah, it's this little girl set in South Africa, and it's just her it's called Here Comes Lolo. Like, it's just regular. So that's so important when you're building your library. Let me check on here and see if we have questions. I don't believe I saw any come through. Not yet. Okay, we'll keep talking. So let's see. I wanted to ask you I think the coronavirus and the current pandemic has shown how small our world is, right? And we are a global economy. And so our kids are going to grow up to be in the workforce and working in an even more diverse world. They're going to be working maybe here in the United States with other people who migrated from different parts of the world, or they're going to be working abroad. So how do you see the role of diverse children's literature impacting kids who are going to grow up into that world? If you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that for me, what's interesting is that a lot of times in my consulting work, when I work with, CEOs or executives, a lot of the conversations I'm having with them, I think, man, I wish I would have had this with you when you were 4 years old.
Yeah.
Like, I wish I could have talked to you when you were 5, because we could have talked about this in a much different way. And what I see is when I'm, my kids live with me, I'm their mom, they're getting the lessons, but it's just something, so they're much, my kids, I feel, are very savvy and have a lot of knowledge about the world because of the books that I've brought to them. And so if they meet somebody that's from a different culture that they're not necessarily familiar with, they have read something somewhere about it. They have some way to relate. And what I think is the difficulty nowadays is that a lot of people have very few friendships or relationships within their everyday life with people who are different than them, whether it's different race, different religion, different socioeconomic status. And books are a window to the world. And if you do this as a parent when they're young, and you can start anytime, I mean, it's never too late. But if you show them this, they become used to the fact that the world is not centered on them. So that's a lesson of parenting that I espouse, is that, kids are obviously, for a lot of reasons, very self-focused, and that's okay. But what you have to do as a parent is also let them know that there's other people's feelings beside theirs. That's just a general parenting. But then there's also people who live a very different life than they do. And believe things that are different than they do, and that's okay. And then like, let's talk about it. We have a lot of Muslim friends and family who do, for example, like Ramadan, and we know when they're doing it because their schedules change and their availability to see us, or like we will sometimes take care of kids for the parents when at the end of the Ramadan period, when the parents are very tired from fasting and the kids need some entertainment, they'll come over here and we talk about it. But when you have books about it and when you introduce these topics to your kids, when they're a 40-year-old executive in a company, they are able to have a conversation with someone during Ramadan. And they've known that since they were 4 years old. It's not a new concept. And I have a lot of kids in my life. I'm like that neighborhood mom that has everyone at her house all the time, except for during coronavirus. But I have had these conversations with other kids who come over and they'll say things that kind of are cringeworthy, but I don't, I'm just like, okay, well, let's talk about that. Like, I've had kids come over and say things about like, whatever, like some kids said something about Chinese New Year this year. And I just had a moment and talked about it. And actually my kids know a lot about that because they are well-versed in that from their Chinese classes at school, but also like they read about it. Like they're not, it's nothing so, it's nothing outside their realm of consciousness. And I think that's what building this library and what I want parents to focus on is if you just build it when they're little, even in the picture books when they're infants and they just see this, it will change your connections in your brain. And you will, when you're older and you're running a company or you're managing people, you'll be able to relate these lessons to stories that you heard when you were a child. And that's what's lacking. And that's why my work in doing corporate diversity and inclusion consulting is difficult because I'm working with people who are, 40, 50, 60 years old, who are managing through a lens of bias that was never confronted as children. And so it's really deeply ingrained. Not that it can't be changed, but it's way more difficult.
And that's the thing, like right now, today, we as parents, we have the power to change it. We have the power to do something. And I think we do our kids such a disservice because I'm sure they're adults now who go, I wish I had learned this or I was exposed to this when I was younger. We do them such a disservice when we don't. We really do. Okay, so let's see. I have a question now. What about nonfiction books for kids that directly speak to racism? There's a lot. There's a lot. I don't have any like right next to me right now, but we published a blog on atlasbookclub.com. If you go to our blog, we published a blog where there's a list. So there are tons of lists out there that are nonfiction books that speak directly to racism. Tons of them. I can't think of any books, and maybe Mindy has some recommendations, but there are tons of lists. We have lists on our website.
Well, and we can give some book recommendations. I'm in my office, so I'm not up at the kids' library, but I will tell you, I ordered a book because due to pandemic life, I'm going to be homeschooling my kids next year. Surprise, everyone who knows me. But I've been buying some books, and I bought a picture book about the Middle Passage, and it directly confronts what that was about for kids, and it's a picture book. And I mean, we confront it directly. So I have books about what racism was about, and all age specific, whatever that is. Ibram Kendi has a book, a baby board book called, it's like how to, an anti-racist baby or something like that. I have a lot of them. I just don't have them with me. But what I would say is these conversations should happen early and often, and talk about why it happens historically. And as your kids get older, you can introduce new intricacies to their understanding. And so I have been teaching my kids since they were little about all sorts of oppression in their language and in an accessible way for them. But as like my son has gotten older, he's 8, you know, he reads the Who Was series, and he reads the
those are good nonfiction ones.
Those are good nonfiction, and they're really accessible. And you know, and then he'll read one. He read the Harriet Tubman one probably like a year ago, and then from that there was just tons of conversation. He wanted to know more. We found some good like historical websites for him to look at. But a lot of it is like tying it to now. And so I'm always big on like, if they read a historical fiction or you read about racism in an abstract, bring it to your family. And like one conversation, and we are gonna have a conversation next time in July here. So get ready for July about how to talk to your kids about racism directly, about what's happening with George Floyd and the uprising that has come from that. And I'm going to tell you how I do it, and Bunmi's going to tell you how she does it. But I will say that when you have these conversations, it needs to be related to your family. And so if you introduce a concept that's very difficult, relate it to your family, and then how you all can do better as we go forward.
And I wanted to add to that, as you were talking, I was trying to think of who has written that I know nonfiction books. Carol Buston Weatherford. So you can Google her. She wrote The Roots of Rap. She also wrote something about gospel music. So she's written quite a few nonfiction books that talk about racism. And I will suggest also, when you're getting nonfiction books that talk about, you know, the civil rights movement and talk about Black history, again, going to shattering the single story. If you're getting stuff, then also get stuff about the history of music, the history of jazz, the Harlem Renaissance, that those are all parts of, and the civil rights movement significantly impacted that, like the Harlem Renaissance. And there are so many rich stories about jazz and about the Harlem Renaissance that you can dig into. So all of this is to say, raising anti-racist kids, right, takes intentional work. It really does. Part of it is building a diverse children's book library, right? There's so many aspects to it. There are many ways to approach this. And so, but it just takes intention. So I know we're at time. I don't see any questions. So we want to respect everybody's time. And I think, you know, if you have any questions, feel free to send questions to info@atlasbookclub.com, or you can drop the questions in the comments, and we'll tackle them. Well, we might tackle in the comments, but we'll also make a note and tackle them during the next session. So let's see, we have a whole list. I'm looking at the list right now, and I think we only talked about 1 or 2. So we're going to continue to have these conversations. I'm really thankful for Mindy, and you know, for her, you know, joining me to have these important conversations. And you know, as I said, it takes intention, and it takes, at the end of the day, about diversity and inclusive children's book, having it be a part of the DNA of your family. So on that, I'm going to say my goodbyes, and thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for taking the time to come out here and come on here and just hear us chit chat. and we'll hope to see you soon. Mindy?
Yeah, and join us in July. We'll be putting the event on Atlas Book Club's Facebook page, where we're going to talk about how to talk to your kids about race and the recent events that are going on. And we're going to have a mom-to-mom conversation about that. So we hope to see you all next time. And please, you know, ask us any questions that you have. And again, be intentional. This doesn't work in a passive way. So.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye.
Have a wonderful evening.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone. Bye.
Bye. All right.